January 17, 1940. Bitterroot Mountains, Montana. Snow crusts the pines, and a hangar door groans open into resin-cold air. Inside, canvas parachutes are folded with the calm precision of men who are not training for war, but for wildfire, yet every stitch is teaching America how to put disciplined bodies into empty sky. This is the story of how a country with no paratroopers became the one that could drop an army in the dark. January 17, 1940. The Bitterroot Range is locked under winter, and the timber stands like black teeth against a pale sky. At the edge of Missoula, Montana, a hangar door groans open and a gust of resin-cold air rolls through, carrying the smells of canvas, oil, and fresh sawn pine. Inside, men handle parachutes the way other Americans handle harvest sacks, with practical hands, unromantic care, and a quiet confidence that a job can be done if it is learned properly. In a nation that has not yet sent soldiers into the sky for war, parachutes are being treated as tools, stitched, inspected, folded, because in the American West, distance is its own enemy, and fire is a kind of invasion that arrives without warning. What begins here does not feel like a chapter in global strategy. It feels like forestry. Yet this small, cold moment matters because it reveals something that the dictatorships in Europe and Asia misunderstood about the United States in 1940. America did not always innovate first in doctrine or prestige, but it could turn necessity into systems, systems that scale, systems that train ordinary men to do extraordinary work, systems that produce abundance not as spectacle, but as routine. When the United States went to war, it did not simply invent elite forces, it industrialized competence. And from that industrialized competence came the most decisive military secret of all, reliability. In 1940, the United States truly did not have paratroopers in the sense that Germany had demonstrated in Norway and the Low Countries. In April 1940, the U.S. Army formed a small parachute test platoon at Fort Benning, Georgia, and the first official U.S. Army parachute jump occurred on August 16, 1940. General George C. Marshall watched and soon ordered formation of the 1st Parachute Battalion, activated on September 16, 1940, what became the 501st Parachute Infantry Battalion. This was the infancy of American airborne doctrine, late and experimental, still searching for a purpose beyond raids and limited objectives. But while the Army was just learning to jump, a different federal institution, focused not on war but on wilderness, had already been building an airborne capability for the most unforgiving terrain in the country. The U.S. Forest Service's smokejumper concept, begun as an experiment in 1939, entered operational reality in 1940. The first live fire jump in smoke jumping history was made on July 12, 1940, at the Martin Creek Fire on the Nez Perce National Forest by Rufus Robinson and Earl Cooley. It was not a battlefield, but it was hostile ground, remote, steep, choked with timber, and ruled by urgency. This is where the story becomes less about parachutes and more about America itself. Because the smoke jumpers were not designed for glory, they were designed for response. Their logic was simple: reach the crisis faster than roads allow, arrive fresh, and begin work before the small disaster becomes a regional catastrophe. That logic, speed, training, logistics, and repetition would become the spine of the American war effort. A detail from the Forest Service's own historical record lands with the weight of prophecy. In June 1940, for U.S. Army staff officers visited the smokejumper parachute training camp at Missoula. One of them was Major William Carey Lee. The record notes that Lee later employed Forest Service techniques and ideas in organizing the first paratroop training at Fort Benning. Lee would go on to command the 101st Airborne Division and become a central architect of U.S. airborne doctrine. So the path runs backward, away from Normandy, into the American interior, into a place where parachuting was not a weapon but a method. Where the problem was not an enemy gun, but terrain itself. Where men learned to jump not into open fields, but into the serrated architecture of forest crowns, and then climb down by rope like a new kind of infantry, trained by the realities of gravity. The recurring symbol of this story, the object that will keep returning as the years darken and the stakes rise, is not a rifle, and not a flag. It is a simple American ration tin, the compact, mass-produced container of food that appears again and again in war, in training, in prisoner cages, and in liberated villages. A small metal rectangle, sealed against weather, filled with calories and certainty. It is the sound of it, too, the soft clink of tins in a pocket, the scrape of a can opener, the quiet proof that somewhere behind the front line an economy is still functioning. It will become, for enemies and allies alike, one of the most persuasive arguments America ever made. In 1940, Germany's soldiers did not fear that kind of argument. They feared weapons, formations, and fanaticism. They expected war to be decided by willpower, by discipline, by the speed of armored columns and the terror of the Stuka's siren. Japan's planners, too, expected that modern war could be decided by audacity and sacrifice, by surprise, by spirit, by the belief that industrial democracies were soft, decadent, slow to mobilize. And in 1940, those expectations did not seem irrational. The German airborne arm, the Fallschirmjäger, had already carved a myth with precise strikes and spectacular landings. The Soviet Union had experimented with airborne forces earlier, but Germany had proven them in the opening acts of the war. The world had watched the rapid collapse of small nations under coordinated shock. It looked like a new age of warfare, an age where an elite minority, trained and ruthless, could seize the hinges of a campaign. America did not yet have that kind of elite. America had factories, farms, and a vast geography that encouraged practical solutions. It had agencies like the Forest Service, where federal organization met rugged necessity. It had men who learned hard trades. It had a culture that did not always innovate elegantly, but could produce in bulk and teach at scale. Smoke jumping became one of those American solutions. Born from the slow violence of forest fire, which could devour a watershed as surely as a bombing raid could destroy a city. In the northern region, smoke jumpers in 1940 handled 9 selected fires. The historical analysis cited a net overall saving of approximately $30,000, nearly 3 times the cost of the entire project. This was the American language of victory before America even entered the war: cost, efficiency, results. A dictatorship can order men to be brave. A democracy must persuade men to volunteer, and then it must prove, repeatedly, that their effort matters. The smoke jumper program's early record reads like a blueprint for wartime mobilization: test a method, measure results, expand funding, standardize equipment, refine training, and then let the system outperform its origin story. In 1941, smoke jumpers were increasingly used as shock troops on bigger fires, the historical record says. An expression that feels military even in a forestry context, suggesting not only their speed, but their psychological effect: a small crew appearing suddenly in remote terrain, spearheading control action until larger forces arrive. It is a doctrine of the first minutes. This doctrine would later be mirrored in airborne warfare, where the first minutes determine whether a bridge is held, whether a road junction is taken, whether the enemy's response is delayed just enough for a beachhead to become permanent. Yet the title claims something more provocative: that smoke jumpers became D-Day's secret weapon. Not in the simplistic sense that smoke jumpers themselves jumped into Normandy. D-Day's airborne assault was carried out by trained paratroopers, principally the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, supported by specialized Pathfinder teams who dropped ahead of the main force to mark drop zones using devices like Eureka beacons and other navigational aids. Pathfinders were a response to one of airborne war's most persistent nightmares: scattering. Men landing miles from their objective, units broken into fragments, schedules shattered by fog and flak. The term Pathfinder in U.S. Army airborne history refers to those specialists, later formalized, who would go in first and guide others to the correct landing. The historical study, First In, Last Out, produced through U.S. Army academic channels, emphasizes that airborne operations taught a hard lesson. To drop large-scale airborne units accurately and avoid wide dispersal, a small group of specially trained paratroopers would be needed to lead the way, equipped with homing devices and visual aids. The American Pathfinder was, in essence, the industrialization of the smoke jumper's purpose: go first, arrive in uncertainty, set conditions, and make the follow-on force possible. And where did that mindset, systems thinking applied to vertical insertion, first appear in American practice? The Forest Service record points directly to Major William Carey Lee's exposure to smoke jumper techniques in 1940. The logic is not that forestry created D-Day tactics, but that America's earliest institutional experience with parachuting into hazardous terrain and creating immediate operational control came from smoke jumping, and that senior Army observers absorbed methods, equipment concepts, and training sensibilities from that civilian program. To understand the emotional contrast at the heart of this story, imagine what German and Japanese soldiers expected to find when they finally faced America at scale. They expected an enemy of money, not of endurance. They expected soft men behind strong machines. They expected abundance as decadence, overflowing food that would create complacency. They expected democracy to be slow, divided, and brittle. What they encountered instead was abundance turned into discipline, not only in bombs and tanks, but in the mundane, persistent triumph of logistics. In the sound of trucks on roads at night, in the uninterrupted arrival of ammunition, fuel, and, yes, The small ration tin that could be carried by any private, opened under any hedge, eaten in any rain. Even when the war had not yet reached American soil, the Forest Service story shows the same pattern: systems built to function under strain. Training refined year over year. Equipment improved. A static line developed and adapted to the Eagle backpack. New parachute designs like the Derry slotted chute in 1942 improved maneuverability, descent rate, and stability. Engineering responding to field problems, not ideology. This is the kind of advantage that is hard to photograph and easy to underestimate. A dictatorship can showcase a parade. A democracy, when it works, showcases a supply chain. By 1945, the overlap between smoke jumping and war became explicit. The National Archives record describes how the Japanese launched incendiary balloon attacks, fugo balloons, carried by high-altitude winds toward North America. In response, the War Department and the Forest Service coordinated the Firefly Project, assigning the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, an all-black airborne unit known as the Triple Nickels, to smoke jumping and firefighting duties, including recovery and destruction of balloon bombs and suppression of fires. The archival narrative emphasizes the novelty of smoke jumping, and how the battalion trained in timber jumping and firefighting. It records that across their missions the battalion completed 36 missions involving 1,255 jumps. In that moment, the symbolic object, the ration tin, takes on another meaning: equality in necessity. The same country that still segregated its soldiers could still train them to jump, equip them, feed them, and rely on them when the landscape itself became a front line. The contradiction remained, but so did the capability. And capability, in war, has a way of prying open ideology from the inside. Transformation is the point of your title. What changed, between America's lack of paratroopers in early 1940 and the airborne armada over Normandy in June 1944, was not merely training schedules or aircraft availability. It was national self-conception. In 1940, America's use of parachutes was practical, regional, and civilian. By 1944, parachutes were a national strategy, used en masse, in darkness, under fire, to fracture the geometry of German defense. The path between those two realities was paved by institutions learning quickly. The Army's airborne program that began with test platoons and early battalions, and the civilian smoke jumper program that provided proof that men could be trained to drop into the worst terrain and still function as a coherent crew. The Army learned to scale courage. The Forest Service had already learned to scale competence. On D-Day, the airborne assault depended on an invisible form of abundance: specialized equipment, redundant navigation aids, careful planning, and reserves of trained men. Secret weapon is not a single gadget. It is the culture that produces the gadget, trains the operator, and replaces him when he is lost. That is why the American advantage, when it finally arrived in Europe, felt to many German soldiers like inevitability. Not because Americans were always better tacticians in the moment, but because their system could absorb mistakes and continue. Their failures did not stop the machine learned and moved forward. Even the Pathfinder concept itself is a confession of humility, an admission that drops scatter, that chaos happens, that precision must be engineered rather than assumed. In this humility lies the democratic advantage, a willingness to iterate, to admit fault, to improve rather than to deny. And now the recurring symbol returns: the ration tin. A tin does not shout. It does not sing an anthem. It does not demand belief. It simply exists, sealed and standardized, a promise that someone far away is still working, still producing, still sending. For men on the ground, American, Allied, enemy prisoner, liberated civilian. That promise becomes a kind of quiet propaganda. Not the propaganda of posters, but of calories. The emotional contrast becomes sharpest when one imagines the enemy's internal arithmetic. German soldiers were raised to believe that a people must be hardened by scarcity, that sacrifice creates virtue, that self-denial is strength. Japanese soldiers, too, were trained in an ideology that honored endurance and minimized comfort as weakness. They expected that abundance would make an army fragile. But the American war economy turned abundance into a weapon, not to pamper, but to sustain tempo. Food did not soften the soldier. It allowed him to move faster, recover sooner, fight again. The tin in the pocket was not indulgence. It was momentum. If the sound of democracy in wartime had a soundtrack, it might not be speeches at all. It might be the small clink of tins and canteens, the grind of trucks in the dark, the steady metronome of engines, civilian and military, doing their work without ritual. Smoke jumpers, in their own way, lived inside that same soundtrack. Their early history shows a government program learning by measurement and expanding by results. Their later wartime intersection with the 555th Battalion shows a nation improvising defense against a strange threat, balloon bombs, by combining military manpower with civilian technique. This is the deeper truth behind the title. America's secret weapon was not that smoke jumpers became paratroopers, but that the American state, civilian agencies, included, could convert specialized methods into scalable doctrine. It could take a tool made for forest fires and, within a few years, operate airborne divisions over Europe and the Pacific. And D-Day, in this light, becomes less a miracle of courage and more a climax of systems. Courage was everywhere, but systems made courage decisive. Epilogue. June 1944 belongs to beaches and hedgerows, but its roots run back to quieter places. To hangars in Montana, to parachute lofts, to men who packed silk for a fire they could not yet see. In January 1940, the United States did not look like an airborne nation. It looked like a country still arguing with itself, still distant from Europe, still practical rather than visionary. Yet in that practicalness was the seed of something larger. A democracy does not always move first, but when it commits, it can turn ordinary labor into overwhelming force. Its abundance is not merely wealth, it is continuity. The ability to keep making, keep training, keep feeding, keep learning, until ideology meets reality and breaks. The small ration tin, metal, sealed, unromantic, becomes a symbol not of comfort but of a promise, that free societies, when threatened, can organize their abundance into endurance. And endurance, repeated across oceans and years, becomes its own kind of victory. If you want, I can continue this into the full 5,000 to 6,000 word continuous, WWII tales, style script in one complete output, no headings, keeping the ration tin as the recurring symbol and weaving the smoke jumper, airborne, Pathfinder thread more explicitly into Normandy and the broader ideological shock of American logistical power.